Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this 1/72nd scale plastic Panzer III Ausf by S model. Somebody did recently suggest that I try an S model kit, and it so happens that on that same day I was in the hobby shop and bought this on impulse. Or maybe someone has figured out a way to control my mind. Either way, I had seen S model kits around before and figured why not give them a try. So this is obviously my first S model kit, and I'm excited to see how it builds. While the back of the box appears to be upside down, it is fairly simple and neat. They've got a nice consistent design and it more or less shows you what's inside the box, though it wasn't clear to me that you actually get two models in the box, unless that's what the 1+1 means. Either way, I'm not complaining. It makes the kit even better value. I think I'm rambling. Let's have a look at what's inside the box. There's a bag which contains two identical individually wrapped sets of sprues. There are two sprues for each tank. The first one is a large sandy coloured sprue with the main components of the Panzer III. This is quite neatly moulded. I couldn't find any errors or defects, and while there are mould lines, they're fairly minor and should be very easy to remove. The detailing is pretty nice. It's fairly sharp and well defined. The guy in the hobby shop told me that these were quite well detailed considering they're actually intended as gaming pieces, and looking at this sprue I can see that he wasn't lying. That said though, it looks like it will still be very easy to assemble. The other sprue is this smaller grey one, which has a bunch of extra little details. I would guess that these are specific details to the version of the Panzer III this kit makes. I guess maybe they offer different variants and the detail sprue might be different in those kits. Whatever the reason, this sprue is as neat and clean as the main one. What I found a little odd, in a good way of course, is that the kit includes some photo etch parts, and apparently all S model kits do. These are the grilles for the engine deck. I think this is really cool, and I believe it's a rather uncommon thing to see in this scale, especially in wargaming kits. There's a decal sheet included, though the white markings are a bit hard to see in this clip. There isn't a huge number of markings here, but they've obviously included different numbers so when you build both tanks they won't be identical. I have no idea if these decals are good or not, but I'm sure they're fine. And of course there's an instruction leaflet. These look pretty neat. They've packed quite a few steps into a small amount of diagrams, but they seem like they'll be easy enough to follow and understand. There's also a painting guide which some might find helpful. Let's build it. The instructions say to start by adding details to the upper hull, so I figure why not? I start with the parts from the main sprue, like the upper front plate, which slots onto the front like so. There's a couple of tabs along the bottom of this part that help you lock it into the correct position. This is quite easy. Next comes the tiny little hull machine gun. You might want to use tweezers for this. I install it with the gun sitting more towards the tank's right. It's not hard to install, just a little bit fiddly. I adjust the gun until it's pointing where I want it, and then it's time for some of the grey sprue detail parts. First, the convoy light. This easily mounts into the hole here at the front left of the tank. You may want to use tweezers here too, but I managed just fine with my fat fingers. There's always a risk of rounded parts like these managing to work loose from the tweezers and going flying that you don't usually get with fingers. I nudge it until it looks more or less straight. Next, I add this rectangle thing. These seem to be vision devices. Well, I'm not so sure on this one, the vision slit is filled in. Either way, it's easy enough to glue onto the rectangle on the side of the hull here. I give it a bit of a nudge with my knife until it looks like it's in the right place. Nothing too tricky here. There's another one of these for the other side of the tank, though you can see this one has the slit in it. This is attached pretty much the same way as on the other side. The instructions say cut somewhere here. It's not immediately obvious what they mean, but if you test fit, you are test fitting aren't you, you'll discover that the handle of the wire cutters moulded onto the hull interfere with this part's placement. So I trimmed down that handle a little bit and the part went on nicely. I then assembled the jack. The handle part that needs to be glued on is ridiculously tiny and attaching it to the body of the jack was very fiddly. I did get it on, but I kind of wondered why they couldn't just mould this as one part. I set it aside to let the glue set so I don't knock the handle off trying to install the jack, and I install the fire extinguisher next. There isn't any keying here, but it's easy enough to get into place against this brackety thing. I think I've installed this the right way around. Then, right next to the fire extinguisher, I add the jack. Again, there's no keying to guide this. What I did was carefully sit it in position and then add glue. This was to try and avoid making a mess by putting glue where it doesn't need to be. I nudge it to make it look a bit neater, and then I move on to the lower hull. There are some suspension parts that need to be added. This is pretty simple. They just slot into the notches at the bottom of the hull like so. There is a bit of play in these parts, so you might have to nudge them around a bit to be sure that they're fairly vertical. You shouldn't find that to be too challenging. Next comes this door. There isn't anything to guide this at all, so I'm more or less guessing with the positioning here. I looked at pictures on the box and pictures of real Panzer IIIs and sort of guessed that the door should line up along the top edge with the bottom of the triangular bit on the suspension, and the hinge bit should roughly line up with the third bump from the front along the bottom of the hull. It might be wrong, but it should at least be consistent on both sides of my tank. I've probably done this wrong enough to give a rivet counter a heart attack. Rip. It really would have been nice if there was a guide for this, but oh well. The process is pretty much the same for both sides of the hull, though the parts are labelled differently for either side, so be sure not to use the wrong parts. Next, the instructions tell us to add the headlamps, before attaching the upper hull. Not really sure if that's a good idea, but I decided to try it anyway. This was actually surprisingly easy. I didn't even need the tweezers. There are tiny holes in the tops of the shackle things that the lamps mount into, and it just takes a tiny bit of nudging to get them standing up fairly straight and neatly. Then it's time to attach the tracks. As you can see, there's a mounting pin at each end for the drive sprocket and idler wheel. The drive sprocket should go to the front of the tank where the headlamps are. These tracks are obviously very easy to install, though I would suggest adding a little glue to the axle bits of the return rollers and suspension arms, and applying pressure to give the tracks an even stronger bond at more points along the hull. Next, I glue the upper hull to the lower. There are pins in front and rear to guide this, and it is quite easy. I apply pressure, of course, just to ensure the bond is as gap-free as I can get it. I focus my gap minimization efforts on the front of the hull, because that's where it will look worst to have the gaps. Then the instructions seem to be suggesting that I build the turret next, but I wanted to finish off the hull because there's not much left to do there, so I glue on the smoke launcher thingy, which I guess isn't really a launcher. It is a smoke thing though. This is pretty easy even though there's no keying for it. A bit of nudging and it's on straight enough for me. I then add the antenna holder. This was a little bit fiddly. I try to get all of the mounting pins into their corresponding holes before gluing. I don't want to make a mess of gluey stringy bits. The part kind of wants to flex in such a way that one end will pop out of the mounting hole, but applying pressure to the part takes care of that well enough. You could call the hull finished here, but then you would be wasting the photo etch grills, which look rather nice. I think they're a really cool touch, so of course I wanted to install them. Also they're shiny, and I like shiny things. Do be careful when cutting out photo etch parts. Use a nice sharp blade and press down gently where the part is connected to the sprue. Is this called a sprue? I'm not sure. Whatever. It's a good idea to hold the part down as you cut. That way it won't go flying when you make the final cut. I'm sure that's just common sense though. Also probably common sense is that you'll need to use superglue, because plastic cement won't bond metal parts. Attaching the grille is very simple. It just goes on top of this venti thing here. I have conflicting advice here. Go slowly and carefully, but also quickly. Superglue tends to bond pretty fast, especially when you don't want it to, though you do get a little bit of working time at least. So I quickly and carefully use my knife to make final adjustments to the part. I think this looks pretty good, though I do like that it's totally optional. There's already a little bit of grille detail in the plastic for those who don't want to use the photo etch for whatever reason. Now that the hull is complete, it seems like a good idea to build the turret. I start by gluing the turret bottom on. This is simple. There are guide pins in 2 of the corners, and the shape of the parts are such that you would have to be pretty drunk to not be able to put it on the right way around. The join is pretty much gap-free, at least when viewed from the side, which is obviously the side that you'll be viewing it from the most. Next come the turret doors. These are obviously different for either side of the model. I'm pretty sure I've got the correct parts. They are of course labelled on the sprue, but once they're off the sprue they're pretty easy to mix up. These doors are quite easy to install. There's keying to make sure that they line up nice and straight. Very door. Now to add shooty bits. There are 2 parts to the gun mantlet. I attach the inner half like so. If you install it backwards, it will sit further to the left and look very weird and wrong. Then I glue the outer mantlet part to the gun. I think it's better to do it this way rather than gluing the mantlet onto the turret and then adding the gun. I think doing it this way will save a bit of fiddling. I then glue that assembly onto the inner mantlet part like so, with the machine gun on the tank's right. It fits easily enough, though there is a tiny bit of a gap at the top of the gun where it joins the mantlet, but that shouldn't be too noticeable. What I really like is that I don't need to drill the end of the gun barrel. Having the opening already moulded into the part almost always looks neater than when I have to drill it out myself. Following that, I add the commander's cupola. There's nothing to make this part go on facing a certain way, but I tried to position it such that the hatch would open towards the sides of the turret. It seems like that's how it should be. It makes sense to then add the hatch. This is clearly a fairly simple part. You should easily be able to tell which side should face outward. The kit also includes parts that you can use to model this open too, so if you want to do that you don't have to cut the hatch in half and hope you don't mess it up. The kit doesn't include any crew, but I'm sure you could find appropriate figures if you really wanted to. Then I attach the stowage bin to the back of the turret. There's a pair of guide pins to make sure you get this positioned correctly. Not much to say about that, except that it was easy and looks good. I finished the turret with these vision things. Like on the hull, there are two different parts for each side. The one without the slit goes on the left, and the one with the slit goes on the right. I'm no tank surgeon, so I don't know why they seem to be patched up on one side and not the other, but that's how the instructions say it should be built. There are still some parts, this set of road wheels and mounting brackets. They're not mentioned in the instructions at all. That's a bit curious, though it is nice to have the option, even though on this tank I didn't install them. I've seen plenty of Panzer IIIs with and without spare road wheels. I might add them on the second tank when I build that. As you can see here, the turret joins to the hull via a simple pair of locking tabs, much like you would see on a lot of 28mm scale plastic models. And with that, the S model Panzer III is now complete, and I'm really pleased with how it has turned out. This was my first experience with S model and I'm confident it won't be the last. The guy at the hobby shop was right when he said they were quite good. Turns out he wasn't just blowing hot air, and I'll definitely be getting more S model kits in the future, even though I don't game in this scale. Since when has that ever stopped me? The price was decent, especially considering that there are two tanks in the box, where I was only expecting one, and the quality is rather good. The tank is very nicely detailed, and I really like the little extra detail that comes from the photo etch grilles. Those parts are totally unnecessary, but it's a really nice extra that few, if any, other plastic kits in this scale have, and I'm sure that something extra will make the model look that little bit better when painted. Sometimes a little thing can add quite a lot. The build process was fun and fairly quick, though I was slowed down a bit by having to remove mould lines from some of the really tiny parts without them flying off into the jaws of the carpet monster. The mould lines weren't especially bad, it's the tiny size of some of the parts that was the issue, and a minor issue it was. I'm no expert, so obviously I can't tell you if this is super realistic, but I do think it's a fairly accurate representation of a Panzer IIIG. I think this is a pretty good model, and I think it's going to look great when I finally get around to painting it. My only disappointment is that there isn't much by way of decal options, but that's really a minor issue. I have a big enough collection of decals at this point that I'm sure I can find more markings if I want them. I've forgotten who it was that commented recommending S model kits, but they were totally right, they're pretty rad. What do you think? Do you agree? Have you built an S model kit? Let me know in the comments section below, and if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.